His tool and calling me over to watch, I couldn't resist and went straight on top of him. Welcome to the channel Infidelity Stories. Hello everyone, my name is Emily, and today I'm going to share with you a very peculiar experience, something I never imagined would happen in my life. This is the story of my first intimate experience with a family member. Never in my life had I felt any kind of attraction to a relative. Perhaps this is what makes this story so surreal. The fact is, this experience involved my Uncle James, someone I had always seen as a family man, a protector, an example of hard work and dedication. But somehow, things took an unexpected turn, and today I will share with you how it all happened. Before I dive into the details, let me describe myself physically so you can imagine me a bit better. I'm 5'7", with a moderately athletic body from years of sports, because I love staying active and healthy. My hair is long, blonde and straight, something I've always been proud of. My eyes are green, a trait I inherited from my mother. I consider myself a pretty woman, to be honest, and I've never had any issues with my self-esteem. My mother raised me on her own, as my father didn't want to take responsibility. From a young age, I learned to value the strength and determination she showed when she found out she was pregnant. Despite knowing my father wouldn't be in the picture, she didn't hesitate to keep the pregnancy. My grandfather, who was a kind and hard-working man, supported my mother the best way he could. He built a small house in his backyard for her to raise me. I grew up surrounded by care and love, even though our family was small. My grandfather was a truck driver, and despite the heavy workload and long trips, he always found a way to be present, to take care of my mother and me. I never felt deprived of anything in my childhood. He was a strong paternal figure, a pillar in our family. Sadly, life has its unexpected twists. About a year and a half ago, my grandfather was diagnosed with cancer, and the illness took him from us very quickly. It was a hard blow, especially for my mother and me, who always saw him as invincible. His absence left a huge void in our lives. After his death, my Uncle James took over my grandfather's truck. Before that, he was always the cool uncle, the one who cracked jokes, made quick visits during holidays, and was always around when we needed something. He had never married and seemed to lead a more solitary life, dedicated to work. At my grandfather's request before he passed, my uncle decided to continue the truck driving routine, taking the same routes and trips my grandfather used to do. Since then, things have changed a lot. My uncle decided it was time to modernize the business a little, so he retired my grandfather's old truck, which was in need of major repairs, and bought a new one. A huge, shiny truck that he seemed proud of, but at the same time, he never wanted to completely get rid of my grandfather's truck. It was as if that vehicle was more than just a means of transportation. It was a symbol of my grandfather's life, the stories he lived, and the memories he left behind. My uncle almost never stays home, always traveling across the country. Every day, he's in a different place. Despite his hectic life, he takes great care of his health. My uncle is 6'4", quite fit for a truck driver. He, like me, is blonde. It runs in the family, though he has a military-style haircut and a short beard. My uncle is quite handsome. Back when my grandfather was alive, my uncle was known for partying a lot, and there were always rumors in the neighborhood that he was quite the ladies' man. Nowadays, he's more focused on work. Well, let's get to the story. 3 days before the summer vacation started, I was set to stay home alone, enjoying some time with friends, both girls and boys, without having to worry about my mother, who wouldn't be home until 8:30 p.m. My mum is a nurse, and sometimes she works 24-hour shifts. It was around 6 p.m. when I decided to open a drink, relax, and think about which of my contacts I'd invite over for the holidays. I've always been confident with men and never lacked intimate company. I was making a snack when I heard my uncle's truck stop in front of the house. He had been on the road for 10 days. I went out to greet him, and we started chatting on the porch until my mum came home from work. She greeted her brother and asked me to prepare dinner while she talked to him. I went to help her since she looked exhausted after a 24-hour shift. We all had dinner together, and after we finished, My mum told me she had to travel to São Paulo for a conference. She said I would have to go with my uncle on his next trip because she didn't want me to stay home alone. I was furious. I had plans and didn't want to spend half my vacation traveling in a truck, but my mother put an end to the argument, saying I had no choice. My uncle would even pay me to help him out on the trip. So, there I was, sitting in the passenger seat of my uncle's truck, leaving Los Angeles and heading toward Nevada for a 3-day trip. Since my uncle had a delivery deadline, I didn't attend the last day of school. After about 5 hours on the road, my uncle made the first stop at a roadside station. We used the restroom, had lunch at a restaurant with amazing food, and then hit the road again. "Uncle, how do you stay in such great shape with this trucker's lifestyle?" I asked, watching him drive. He laughed and answered without taking his eyes off the road. "At first it was hard, but now I make my own food in the truck's kitchen, and I never skip my exercises." That's how we started to chat, and since I had no other choice, I couldn't stay angry for the whole trip. The day passed, and we made a few more stops before my uncle decided to pull over for dinner and rest. We stopped at another roadside station, where there were about 5 trucks parked. My uncle cooked us a meal in his truck's small kitchen: rice, beans, and chicken breast. We talked for a while before deciding to shower. At the shower facility, my uncle and I both undressed, as it was a communal shower area. I was used to showering in locker rooms, so I wasn't embarrassed. We both cleaned up, and afterward, I noticed we were the last ones left in the shower area. As we dried off, I couldn't help but glance at my uncle. He had the body of a model with a chiseled abdomen that made me pause. I quickly looked away, but not before he caught me staring. "What's up?" he asked, noticing my embarrassment. "Oh, nothing," I replied, feeling my face flush. He grinned, clearly enjoying the awkwardness. "Well, you seem pretty shocked," he said, laughing. "Don't worry, it happens." We both laughed, and I could feel the tension between us, but we decided to move on with the night. After all, it was just the beginning of a long trip. After we both dressed and returned to the truck, my uncle started preparing the sleeping arrangements. He turned the driver and passenger seats around, reclined them, and expanded the bed in the back of the truck. It made for a reasonably large sleeping area. Once he finished setting it up, he lay down on one side. While he was getting comfortable, I decided to step outside to have a smoke. I didn't want my uncle to see me smoking, so I grabbed my tobacco and headed out, telling him I was just going to get some fresh air. He was clearly exhausted from the long drive and probably wouldn't notice that I'd been gone for a while. As I sat down on a small bench beside the truck, I lit my cigarette, looking around. The truck was parked in a secluded spot with nothing but fields on one side and a few distant trucks on the other. I was trying to enjoy the quiet when I saw my uncle open the truck door and walk over to me, looking serious and only wearing his boxers. "What are you doing, Emily?" he asked, approaching me. His eyes landed on the cigarette in my hand. "Smoking, obviously," I replied, a bit sheepishly. I tried to hide it, but there was no point. He had already caught me. "You know smoking is bad for you," he said with a stern look. "Come on, Uncle, relax. It helps me concentrate, and I don't do it all the time. Just occasionally," I said, trying to ease the tension. "Never mind that," he replied, shaking his head, still looking at the cigarette. I smiled, trying to lighten the mood. "You've never smoked before?" I asked, teasingly. "Here, try it. It'll be our little secret." I handed the cigarette toward him, trying to make him feel more at ease. He hesitated for a moment, then, to my surprise, took the cigarette. After a quick, awkward puff, he started coughing uncontrollably. The sight of my uncle struggling with the smoke was hilarious, and I couldn't help but laugh. "Take it easy, Uncle. Inhale slowly, then let it out," I said, still laughing while he struggled to catch his breath. "That stuff burns your throat," he muttered, his eyes watering from the smoke. He attempted another puff, this time handling it slightly better, though he was still clearly out of his comfort zone. "Relax. You'll feel better once the effects kick in," I said, taking the cigarette back from him for another drag. I was used to it by now and knew exactly what to expect. I sat down on the ground, leaning against the truck, savouring the moment. My uncle sat down beside me, rubbing his throat as if to ease the irritation caused by the smoke. Slowly, the atmosphere between us became more relaxed. We started chatting about all sorts of things, as if the usual boundaries between us had dissolved. We laughed and shared stories, even ones we'd usually keep private. I told him about some of my recent adventures, the kind of things I normally only shared with close friends. He listened intently, occasionally laughing at the funny parts. Gradually, he began to open up as well, telling me about his wild younger days. I was surprised by what I heard, as I'd always seen him as the serious uncle who was too busy with work to have much fun. The lightheadedness from the smoke started to set in, and I felt more carefree, like everything was funnier and more relaxed. I looked at my uncle and noticed that he was feeling it too. He was laughing at every little thing, like everything I said was the most hilarious joke he'd ever heard. We both started laughing uncontrollably, not even knowing why anymore. The story is not over yet. Please consider subscribe. The night was warm, the air heavy and the sky clear, full of stars. It felt like nothing else mattered but the moment we were sharing. As the night wore on, the effects of the smoke intensified. My body felt light, as if I were floating. My uncle looked over at me with a goofy smile. "I think I'm starting to feel that wave you were talking about," he said, and we both burst out laughing again, as if it was the funniest thing in the world. But deep down, we both knew it wasn't just the smoke. It was the connection we were sharing, something deeper than just a silly moment. As the conversation went on, I grew curious about my uncle's love life, especially since he was always on the road. "Uncle, how do you manage to have relationships when you're always traveling?" I asked directly. It was something that had always intrigued me, considering his lifestyle. He was a bit embarrassed by the Hafi question, but answered honestly, as he usually did. "Honestly, it's hard. I usually just, take care of myself. It's risky to mess around with strangers on the road. Too easy to catch something," he said frankly. His straightforward answer caught me off guard, but knowing him, it didn't surprise me. He was always blunt. "Wow, Uncle. How long has it been since you were with someone?" I asked, this time with no shame. Our connection was strong enough that I felt comfortable asking such personal questions. He chuckled, clearly amused by the conversation. "It's been about a year," he replied, still laughing. "I can't believe I'm having this conversation with my niece," he added, laughing even louder. I laughed with him, but as he stood up to stretch, I suddenly noticed something that made me stop laughing abruptly. There was a clear bulge in his boxers. "Well, it seems like you weren't kidding, Uncle," I said playfully, pointing to the obvious situation. He immediately stopped laughing, looking down and realizing what had happened. The light-hearted mood from just moments ago seemed to shift into something heavier, more intense. He awkwardly scratched the back of his head. "Sorry, Emily, it's been a long time, and talking about this stuff with you plus the buzz from the smoke, it's got me more worked up than I expected," he admitted quietly, his voice lower now. I could see how embarrassed he was, but I decided to tease him a little to ease the tension. "No worries, Uncle. Why don't you watch a video on your phone and take care of it?" I joked with a playful grin, trying to make light of the situation. He hesitated for a moment, clearly uncomfortable, but then nodded. "All right, I'll take care of it. Give me a moment," he said, awkwardly grabbing his phone and heading off to a more private part of the truck. I stayed outside, letting him have his privacy. The whole situation was so surreal, I couldn't help but laugh to myself. But then, dark clouds quickly gathered in the sky, and a sudden storm began, with heavy rain pouring down in an instant. I had no choice but to run back to the truck to avoid getting drenched. When I opened the door to get inside, I realized that my uncle was still in the back, clearly caught in the middle of his private moment. He looked as startled as I was when I walked in on him, his eyes wide with shock. He fumbled around trying to cover himself up, but it was no use. I couldn't help but burst into laughter at the absurdity of it all. "I'm so sorry, Uncle. I didn't mean to walk in on you," I said, still laughing while he tried to pull his clothes back on, clearly mortified by the situation. "Emily, I thought you were going to wait outside," he exclaimed, looking flustered. "I was, but it started raining. Don't worry, Uncle, just act like I'm not here," I teased, still finding the whole situation hilarious. He groaned, shaking his head. "I can't. I'm not going to do that with you in here." "Well, I'll just step out again then," I said, laughing. But the rain was coming down harder now, and I wasn't eager to head back out into the storm. I could see he was still uncomfortable, so I decided to push things a bit further. "You know what, Uncle? Why don't we just both relax a bit?" I suggested provocatively. My uncle looked at me, confused and a bit startled. "What are you saying, Emily? We can't do this, it's wrong," he tried to argue, but there was something in his eyes that told me he wasn't as sure of his words as he sounded. I looked him straight in the eyes and smiled, trying to calm him down. "Uncle, I enjoy intimate moments when I'm feeling the buzz from smoking, and since there's no one else here, we can both just relax," I said, as I started to touch myself, making it clear that I wasn't ashamed of my desires. My uncle sat there, frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. But then, as if giving in to his own internal struggle, I saw him glance down at himself. His desire hadn't diminished at all, and I could see the temptation building in him. "Come on, Uncle, enjoy the moment too. Your body's clearly not backing down," I said with a playful tone, watching as he finally started to ease into the situation. He hesitated, but soon he too began to touch himself, each of us staying on our own side of the truck's bed, as if respecting some invisible boundary. The atmosphere in the truck had completely shifted. The intensity of the moment was undeniable. The air between us was thick with tension, and yet neither of us made a move to stop. It was like we had silently agreed to cross a line neither of us thought we ever would. As the minutes passed, the boundaries that had once been so clear between us seemed to blur, and we found ourselves inching closer to one another, sharing this intimate moment. The rhythm of the rain outside the truck only heightened the intensity of what we were experiencing, making the world beyond feel distant and irrelevant. When it was finally over, we both sat there in a mix of exhaustion and disbelief, as if the gravity of what had just happened was slowly settling in. My uncle was the first to speak, his voice a bit shaky but trying to keep things light. "Well, that was unexpected," he said, letting out a nervous laugh. I couldn't help but smile back at him. "Yeah, you could say that," I replied, feeling the weight of the situation, but also strangely at peace with what had happened. We had shared something that, while unconventional and unexpected, was undeniably powerful. After a few moments of quiet, we both started to laugh, as if the tension had finally broken. The night had transformed into something neither of us had anticipated, and though it felt surreal, it was a memory that would stay with us forever. The next morning, we woke up as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. We packed up the truck and continued our journey, driving through the open roads like we had the day before. The trip felt quieter after that night, but not in an uncomfortable way. There was a sense of mutual understanding between us, a secret we now shared, something that would remain just between us. As we made our way back to Los Angeles, I thought about everything that had happened. It wasn't something I had ever imagined, but in some strange way, it felt like we had crossed a barrier that neither of us had ever thought about before. It wasn't just about the physical connection, but something deeper, something that brought us closer in a way that words couldn't fully explain. When we finally arrived home, my uncle dropped me off at the house. We didn't say much to each other, but as he drove away, he gave me a knowing look, one that told me we both understood what had transpired between us. It wasn't something we would talk about, but it was something that would stay with us, a moment frozen in time. Looking back on it now, that night feels like a dream, a surreal experience that will always be etched in my memory. It was a night that changed my relationship with my uncle forever. Not in a bad way, but in a way that made us understand each other on a deeper level. We had shared something that no one else would ever know about, a secret that bonded us in a way that nothing else ever could. The next few days after returning home were strange. My mind often wandered back to that night, replaying everything that had happened between me and my uncle. Every now and then, I would catch myself smiling, not entirely sure how to feel about the whole situation. It wasn't guilt exactly, but a feeling of disbelief, as though I had stepped into another world for a moment, and now I was back to my normal life. My uncle, Emily, didn't mention anything about it either. He returned to his truck driving, leaving town again just a few days after we got back. His visit had been brief, as always. I was left alone with my thoughts, unsure of how our next interaction would go. Would it be awkward? Would we pretend it never happened? There was a part of me that was curious to find out, but another part that was terrified of what the answer might be. As the days turned into weeks, I fell back into my routine. My friends came over, we spent time together, and life seemed to resume its usual pace. But that night with my uncle remained in the back of my mind like a secret I carried that no one else could know. I wondered if it had affected him as much as it had me, or if to him it was just another fleeting moment. About a month later, my uncle returned for another visit. I knew he'd be coming because my mother had mentioned it casually over dinner the night before. "Emily will be stopping by for a few days," she said, not realizing the weight those words carried for me. My heart skipped a beat. What would it be like to see him again after everything that had happened? Would it be the same as before? When his truck pulled up in front of the house, I felt a nervous excitement building in me. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I couldn't deny that there was something thrilling about seeing him again. When he stepped out of the truck, he was the same Emily, tall, blonde, with that same confident, relaxed demeanor. But as his eyes met mine, there was a flicker of recognition, something unspoken that passed between us. We exchanged casual greetings as if everything was normal. My mother greeted him with her usual warmth, and we all sat down for dinner together, just like before. But underneath the surface, I could feel the tension simmering. Every glance, every movement felt charged with the weight of our shared secret. That evening, after my mother had gone to bed, my uncle and I were left alone in the living room. The air between us felt thick with anticipation, like we were both waiting for the other to speak first. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, my uncle broke the silence. "So, how have you been?" he asked, his voice casual, but his eyes telling a different story. "I've been good," I replied, trying to sound nonchalant though my heart was racing. "And you? How's life on the road?" "Same as always. Busy, tiring," he said with a slight smile. "But I've been thinking about that night," he added quietly, his eyes locking onto mine. There it was, the unspoken truth that had been hanging between us. I swallowed hard, not sure what to say. Part of me wanted to ask him how he felt about it, but another part of me was afraid of the answer. Instead, I nodded, acknowledging that I had been thinking about it too. "We probably shouldn't have done that," he said after a moment, his voice low. "But it happened, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it." I felt a strange mixture of relief and anxiety wash over me. He had been thinking about it too. I wasn't alone in this. But at the same time, the reality of the situation was starting to sink in. What had happened between us wasn't just a fleeting moment, it had left a mark on both of us. "Yeah. Me neither," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. We sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of our confession hanging in the air. There was no going back from what we had done, but the question now was, what came next? That night, as I lay in bed, my mind was racing. I couldn't stop thinking about my uncle, about the possibility of something happening again. There was a part of me that knew it was wrong, that we shouldn't cross that line again. But another part of me, the part that had experienced that intense connection, was drawn to the idea of revisiting that night, to feel that thrill again. As if sensing my thoughts, I heard a soft knock on my bedroom door. My heart jumped. I knew who it was. I hesitated for a moment, my pulse quickening, before I got out of bed and opened the door. There he stood, my uncle, his face serious yet conflicted. Without saying a word, he stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of the moon casting shadows across his face. We didn't need to speak. The air between us was charged with the same unspoken tension as before. He took a step closer, and I felt the same electricity that had sparked between us that night in the truck. My breath caught in my throat as he reached out, gently touching my arm. The familiar heat spread through my body, and I knew in that moment that we were about to cross that line again. "Are you sure about this?" he asked softly, his eyes searching mine for any sign of hesitation. I nodded, unable to find the words. My heart was pounding in my chest, the anticipation overwhelming. This was it, the point of no return. He moved closer, his hand gently cupping my face as he leaned in, our lips meeting in a slow, tentative kiss. It was softer than I expected, filled with the weight of everything unspoken between us. But as the kiss deepened, the hesitation melted away, replaced by the same intense connection we had shared that night on the road. Everything after that was a blur, a whirlwind of emotions and sensations as we gave in to the desire that had been building between us for weeks. There was no stopping it now. We were both too far gone. Before you leave, remember to subscribe to the channel by activating the Tinkerbell to receive notification every time.